welcome to the final technical presentation. So the talk outline is to obviously summarise the key findings of what the GA-GSV Stavely project has delivered. We're going to speak about vectors for mineral exploration in Stavely and suggestions for any potential mineral exploration programs that may happen in the future out there. And those themes are going to be kind of peppered throughout the talk. And briefly at the end, we're going to touch on data accessibility and data set availability. So we're all pretty comfortable now with the revised geodynamic setting of the Stavely Arc. So it transformed from the passive continental margin on the eastern edge of Gondwanaland, and that occurred between 700 and 580. We had subduction initiation that may have started as old as 525 MA. At least we've got constraints on rocks in the back arc position. And then we had trench advance, slab flattening, transpression at around 505, and then sudden subduction extinction, transtension environment, melting of those magmas and emplacement into the arc that had already been formed, and that it was all caused by the collision of this continental micro-fragment that's out to the southeast of Stavely. We don't know whether that truly represents, so around 500 million years, we don't know whether that truly represents the extinction of the arc. It could be as young as 485. There's still emplacement of magmas into the back arc position at 485 in the Pathway Ridge, and the Macquarie Arc, which obviously the Stavely Arc jumps outboard to the Macquarie Arc, the youngest or the oldest volcanics in that area of 485. We've discussed the relative positions of VHMS systems in the fore-arc, back arc, and remember that they're relatively early, potentially. So those will have gone a lot of rotation during this transpression and would be preserved in a vertical orientation, potentially. And the porphyry epithermal systems have formed pretty late in the piece and would be preserved upright because once this docked, subduction went extinct, jumped outboard, and then really nothing's happened to it since. Just bring the message home about, if you're in the dull rocks, you're in the right position. This is the Grampian Stavely zone surrounded by the hot, relatively high temperature metamorphics of the Glenelg River metamorphic complex and the Moorabool metamorphic complex in the Stawell zone. And if we look at the retro deformational cartoons that Russ and Phil have shown, if we just step back from the early Devonian back into what the arrangement would have looked like pre that Bindian deformation, we restore the belts nicely into 4 nicely behaved slices of arc, which obviously have mineralised potential in the exposed portions. Now we know that they're correlated geochemically. We can increase prospectivity along those belts, and we can be a bit more predictive about where mineral systems may occur. One thing to note is we did this same exercise with the retro deformation using the mineral occurrences, but because they're so spatially restricted currently, when you actually deform them back to their original position at this time, they haven't moved that much. So it's not like we're expanding. We're saying there's no mineralisation down here, and then at this time it had moved a significant distance. It hasn't moved that far, but we're saying there's prospective nonetheless. And then we touched earlier on the fertility indicators as a predictor for additional prospectivity for VHMS and porphyry systems. Ross mentioned the furphy or the curveball that you may be thrown by differentiating early arc structures, which may concentrate the location of magmas and hence hydrothermal fluids and potentially mineral systems. This is a arcuate structure which truncates pretty consistent volcanic stratigraphy, alternating magnetic and non-magnetic volcanic stratigraphy in the Dryden belt. And what you'll see is this fault, the Dryden fault, is a D1A fault. This fault here, the Muirhus fault, is a later D3 fault. And what this means is that obviously it's cross-cut by a D1A fault, so this is a pretty early fault, and that might be significant for exploration targeting. Ways you'd pick that actually in the field would be differences in facing directions of the volcanic belt. So you might be able to do that using your forward modelling of your geophysical data, or if you've done diamond core, you'd be able to pick that in Younging indicators. So these will be able to predict location zones of dilation during the Delamerian and potentially use as a targeting tool for mineralisation. The 3D model that Mark just gave a great presentation about, that the documentation attached to that has a detailed movement history of all those faults. So you'll be able to step through and turn them on and off and see how they've interacted and what could have been active at the time of arc magmatism. DT spoke about preservation potential. So obviously this is the age window that we're looking at, 500 million years. When we go into the more recent times, that's obviously where we see a lot more porphyry style mineralisation preserved, but we're pretty happy that this is a pretty good time to be out in Western Victoria for arc-related mineral systems, because it's been buried during that Silurian Ordovician sedimentation, and it's been stable since the early Devonian, as evidenced in the apatite fission track data. One thing as well is we look at the metamorphic grade across the regional metamorphic grade across the Grampian Stavely zone, and in the Cambrian rock, it seems pretty uniform, so then there's no large differential uplift. So those exposed areas of known mineralisation are also that they should have been exposed or near surface elsewhere in the arc rocks. Touching on how surface geochemistry may work, we've got to beware about deep weathering profiles, which may generate depletion zones, and that obviously presented a problem for people who were drilling short holes, taking a sample and getting anomalously depleted geochemistry. Mel spoke about the massive increase that we've done as part of the data, historical mineral exploration data compilation exercise, so that 91% increase in the surface geochem data available, and that's mostly soil data, but still it's relatively restricted to the exposed portions of the volcanic belts. And again, those limited detection limits and very limited analytical suites cause a problem for interpreting the data. Out that way as well, it's a lot of agricultural land use, so that might actually impact on the types of geochemical signals that you see, so you might want to think about that when you get certain anomalies. We've got work that was completed as part of the CRC LEAM and adjacent to the store zone. It found that partial digestion generated at false negatives in superficial geochemical data. It also found that sampling of pathogenic carbonate in the Murray Basin cover wasn't much use, because this area of Australia obviously receives a lot of rainfall compared with other areas. As part of the GSV project, and this is all covered in the regional synthesis, 3 orientation surveys were completed over blind targets. So one that was covered by Grampian's group, one that was in outcropping Glen Thompson sandstone but at depth, and one that was covered by Murray Basin. So that work applied ionic leach, mobile metal ion, and soil gas hydrocarbon work, and that found pretty encouraging results at detecting that mineralisation above cover and at significant distances. So I direct you to the report to read about the results of that. The 3D model, all the hard work's been done for you. The Cambrian intrusive rocks have been colour-coded and separated out from the Devonian intrusive rocks. The key thing here is that the Devonian intrusive rocks are thought to be largely north east trending, and the Cambrian intrusive rocks have a north component, and that was all to do with the orientation of the stress field at the time of emplacement. So it's fundamentally different in the Cambrian compared with the early Devonian rocks. And that's pretty useful because geochemically these rocks are pretty similar, the Cambrian and Devonian intrusions. So we'd encourage you, if you truly do want to know the age of these rocks and actually test this concept, that geochronology would be key to actually nail down the actual timing of magma emplacement. That's obviously also key because, again, it's like 14 stratigraphic holes in 20,000 square kilometres, so we can't have sampled everything. So we're looking for additional evidence of the duration of magmatism in the Stavely Arc. We can use the distribution of the volcanic belts and the faults that disrupt them as a targeting tool to predict where mineralisation may occur. Again, this picture that DT showed showing it's pretty flat out there. So the cover thickness is also provided for in the 3D model. And there's, again, that blue Bible about the geology of the Murray Basin rock units. We also did a compilation exercise of drillers' logs from water bores, obviously because it's largely agricultural land, so there's a lot of water bores out there. So that's perfect for hydrogeochemical sampling, but also reconstructing additional lithological information from water bores for detailed geological information where we don't have any information based on previous drilling or outcrop. Cassidy presented information about there are a variety of pathfinders that seem to pick up anomalism within and outside belts and away from areas of known existing mineralisation. As said previously, there's lots of water bores available for sampling. There's lots of additional data available too. This grey reference in OJS would be very useful to integrate the GSV data with. And also down at Werribee, we've got a lot of water bore cuttings and core available for sampling as well, if you want to do some targeted geochemistry on those, particularly where it obviously intersected basement. In terms of drilling, the data compilation exercise that Mel talked about was a nearly 20% increase in actual mineral exploration drill collars, predominantly percussion, 93%. The average depth is very limited. All the lithology, downhole survey, rock properties, sample metadata, and XRF oxide analyses, that's all new. That hasn't been captured previously. And the lithology, just to give you an idea of how big that task was, that was over 150,000 records, and there were 40,000 new records for metal assay results. And coming back to the point that Cam said at the start of the day as well, that the majority of the drilling was pre the publication or the collation and publication of GSV aeromagnetic data as part of the Victorian Initiative for Minerals and Petroleum. Phil presented excellent details about how we can apply filters to get more out of regional geophysical data sets. There's also a lot of rock property data available for anyone who'd want to do any forward modelling or inversion to refine belt distribution, but also at the belt to camp to prospect scale, there's also room for improvement for the line spacing as well, but also to improve gram gravity stations as well. And that represents obviously a relatively low cost, low impact method of exploration in the area. Tony produced a lot, covered all the passive seismic data that was collected as part of the project. And Suzanne touched on the fact that there's a lack of modern EM and IP surveys in the area. And there's a particular dearth of information about the Glen Thompson sandstone, which obviously now we're saying could potentially host porphyry and epithermal systems, and that's from obviously the known mineral occurrences, the distribution of those, but also the fact that we've refined the timing to be older and the same age as the Arc. Geophysical information, this is a really good source of information about the known minerals, the geophysical response of the known mineral occurrences out that way. And I just want to touch on a couple of other data sets, so I apologise if this seems a bit disparate. So there's a lot of hyperspectral data that was collected as part of the program using the HYDROGEOCHEMISTRY. That demonstrated in this this is a Stavely 17 hole, so you remember that's the hole from Fairview South, the epithermal precious metal occurrence in the just outside of the Stavely belt in the Glen Thompson sandstone. And we see here that it's identified kaolinitic pyrite alteration, so advanced argillic alteration associated with a small porphyry dike. And as well, as we step away, there's a lot of quartz sericite pyrite and sericite pyrite alteration both above and below the dike and the mineralisation. And Stavely Minerals have obviously used that as a exploration targeting vector. So they've taken the HYDROGEOCHEMISTRY data for holes at Thursday's Gossan, plus TerraSpec data that they collected on those holes as well, to use the ALOH feature of white marker, so the 2200 nanometer feature, to say these relatively low wavelength features are associated with lower pH, so more likely associated with the mineralising fluid. We haven't talked about this at all today, so we did chlorite epidote geochemistry in collaboration with the guys down at Codes at Farm Eclipse and Thursday's Gossan. So here's a map of the Eclipse prospect. The known mineralisation is down here. This is another sample that we took up here. We've plotted here antimony versus arsenic. You see these samples just here plot at relatively low antimony and low arsenic, and they're removed from mineralisation. So these would be interpreted as associated with regional metamorphic alteration as opposed to propylitic alteration associated with porphyry mineralisation. These samples up here obviously represent higher arsenic and antimony concentrations, and they're all from locations relatively close to mineralisation. One thing that we should note is we get high arsenic antimony, though that's interpreted to be the edge of a porphyry system, and as we get closer to the centre of a porphyry system, we start to get lower arsenic and antimony numbers because there's more sulphide available to sequester those elements. So there's less availability for antimony and arsenic to go into epidote, hence the low values. So it's saying that these samples are relatively a little bit distal, and then these are getting closer. So potentially using the spatial distribution of those samples, this is an exploration vector at Eclipse to the southeast, where there's been no drilling to actually prove this concept. One thing we should note though, that this is a relatively small sample suite, only 4 samples, but it shows a potential exploration vector nonetheless. Also because the mineralisation at Eclipse likely represents a VHMS style system, all these concepts were developed on porphyry systems, so we're actually unsure whether they're directly applicable to VHMS, but we did it anyway. We also did chlorite. I'm not presenting the data for chlorite from Thursday's Gossan. It's a bit of a complicated pattern. What that complicated pattern might reflect is several episodes of intrusion, which have resulted in resetting of the geochemistry of the chlorites, the needed chlorites. But of note is for one hole, we took 2 samples that were separated by 100 metres vertically, and what we found in there is the deeper sample was interpreted to be the more proximal sample. So that's suggesting a potential vertical component in terms of temperature. So drilling deeper might lead to more exploration success at Thursday's Gossan. Just basing on pyrite geochemistry that was also completed in collaboration with Codes, we see that Eclipse is enriched in typical elements for a VHMS system, so manganese, arsenic, thallium, and gold, and actually this rim of gold is running 100 ppm gold. At Thursday's Gossan, we see a completely different style of pyrite trace element geochemistry. We see enriched cores of nickel and cobalt, and what's that? That's suggesting very high temperature fluids. And then we see copper and silver dropping out in a later fracture network, suggesting an overprinting mineralising event. At the epithermal occurrence in Stavely 17, we see a similar thing. So high temperature cobalt, nickel, and then low temperature arsenic gold overprint. And interesting enough, we did a few samples from the regional stratigraphic drilling, and Stavely 4 is from the Brisbane belt, not near any mineral occurrences. We actually see a similar pattern where it's enriched in this potentially low temperature epithermal overprint. And in fact, Jeff Stedman, who did the work at Codes, he in fact interpreted that as being pretty proximal to a mineralised mineral system. I'd like to touch on the fact that in Victoria we're very lucky to have 3 pretty active geoscience departments, particularly at the University of Melbourne and Monash, who've had expertise in this area, and up at Federation Uni who have particularly strong expertise in mineralogy and hydrothermal alteration. So if you want to avail yourself of help from those guys, I'm sure they'd be very accommodating. Also, these are all embedded links, so you don't need to scribble down any URL links. I'm assuming these will go out with the presentations when they get distributed to everyone, so you'll just be able to click on them and find information that's pertinent to the geoscience data that's been presented today. So we've got the GA and GSV hosted separate Stavely project project pages, which are largely complementary. We also have the GSV online store, which delivers all the publications that we've published. There's a lot of information in the seamless maps at a variety of scales, particularly at Stavely. A lot of it will be 1 to 250K because of the cover, but where there's detailed bedrock geology at 150K, that'll be available. Downloadable link straight to the 3D model. Those mineral exploration open file data sets that everyone's spoken about are available too. And GeoVic, which is GSV's online mapping tool, also has a really useful layer, not a lot of people are aware of it, that actually provides all the spatial data sets that are available and a download link for those if they are downloadable. But also it's got a wealth of geographic cultural data on there as well. And that's also probably available from data.vic as well. The GSV Search Assistant is a useful tool for historical mineral exploration reports, and we've also got a lot of national databases which deliver geophysical information, rock property information, whole rock geochem, geochron, HYLOGGR and geochron again. And the AusGeom portal as well, a lot of information's getting put on that, so that's the Australian Geoscience Information Network portal. A lot of information's getting delivered on that, so you can be able to go to one place and get information from all jurisdictions. Any questions?